Welcome, everybody. This is Jerry Koch-Gonzalez with Sociocracy for All. We're here to talk about the sample governance agreement and what that looks like. When we think of an organization, two questions immediately. What is the aim or purpose? You need to be really clear on that. That's your invitation for everyone to join and participate in your organization. The second question is, how and by whom will decisions be made? How decisions will be made? It's like, so think of decision making. It's what are the rules of the game? When I was a parent of sort of a young boy, I watched how many hours he spent arguing with his friends about the rules of the games that they were inventing. You need to know the rules of the game in order to play the game. So there's the famous book, Hoyle's Rules of Games, that tells you how to play cards and everything else. And if you know how to play the game, then you can actually play together. Otherwise, you end up arguing. Then there is the famous book called Robert's Rules of Order that tells the rules of the game of parliamentary democracy, who can speak when, and so on. That's really, the Robert's Rules of Order is kind of the main book that has dominated how every legislature that's called so-called democracy works. When you don't know the rules of the game, you either argue or whoever's got the power makes the decisions about how they want to do things. So for example, in the United States right now, we are going through an impeachment process, the possibility of getting rid of our current president, but there are no real rules of the game of that process. And so the majority party is deciding how they're going to do it. And there's nothing else pretty much that the minority party can do, because they have the power and they make the rules. There's not been a process beforehand that more collectively decides what are the rules of the game before we actually start the game. So I want to put something in context. Again, Sociocracy, from my point of view, is built on three key elements that help us move towards achieving our aim or purpose of our organization. And these are the elements that will be embodied into the agreements, the governance agreements that you make. Decision-making by consent, organizational structure by linked circles, and continuous evolution by feedback, with the underlying values of how can we be effective and egalitarian. And it's also, whenever we talk about governance agreements, it becomes really useful to not only have the diagram I just showed you of what are the things that we're trying to achieve, but what's the organizational structure? What does it look like before we get into many, many words? So organizational structure would usually have a board of directors or a mission circle. That is the parent circle to what we would call a general circle or a coordinating circle or a management circle. That in Sociocracy would be made up of leaders and delegates of the main core working groups. So in this diagram, you see three core working groups, each of whom has leaders and delegates serving on the general circle. And each of those groups may have its own subcircles, and they may have subcircles of their own. So an organization can be quite large or small, always using this circles and subcircles format with the double linking. And a key element in Sociocracy is that of distributed authority. We're trying to end the whole system of power over, where the top makes the decisions and everyone else follows. So distributed authority means that the subcircles are within their domain of authority. They're able to make decisions, and they don't have to go checking in upstairs the powers that be to tell them what to do. So distributed authority. But what goes with distributed authority is the responsibility to get feedback. If we're going to distribute authority in order to trust that smaller groups are going to make decisions that affect all of us, then we need to have the trust that they're going to take all of our feedback seriously, so that they are acting in for the good of the whole and not just simply for their limited perspective from that group. So if we look at the circle in the middle, that's a circle that has a particular authority to make decisions. And if it's going to look at a particular issue that impacts others, how is it going to get feedback? It can ask feedback from a parent circle that has a broader perspective. It can ask feedback from a subcircle that has a more particular narrow perspective. It can ask for feedback from another sibling circle, another circle in the organization that maybe has some related interests, related experience. They can create a helping circle to do more research. Oh, we can't just simply make a decision here. We need to gather more information. So let's create a helping circle that would gather that input to create the context in which we can make a more responsible decision. They can go to individuals who they know have strong opinions. So look at who represents the margins in our organization of different opinions here. Let's go talk to them to make sure we gather their perspectives. And you can go to the whole organization by getting input at whole organization meetings or by doing surveys to gather data. So all the different ways of gathering feedback. You have a question, it comes to a circle, they gather feedback, and they make a decision. So the quality of feedback is central to the trust in the sociocratic system. If an organization does not get the appropriate level of feedback, then different parts of the organization or individuals will come back and say, what are you doing? You're violating our sense of trust of gathering feedback. Maybe I don't like sociocracy if you all can just make those kind of decisions without input. There are, I think of as three kind of overlapping levels of documentation in the process of implementing sociocracy. There are the legal documents of the organization. What is it that states your existence legally? The articles of incorporation or others, the master deed, etc. might be. Then there are the bylaws, and this is where things get a little tricky because different countries, different provinces or states have different laws. So there are some documentation about how your organization is governed. In this session, I'm not going to talk about the legal aspects. That's a whole nother session which needs even more preparation than I'm ready to do. It's still a growing edge for us to figure out what's that link between how we know we want to run and how governments set up their laws. The second element is what I call the governance agreement. Sorry, I keep going back. That is the definition of how will sociocracy work in our organization or community. That's what we're going to be focusing on. The third level is what else is in the policy manual of our organization, our community agreements. What are all the other kind of policy decisions that affect the organization? So, for example, the policies that affect an organization. I live in a co-housing community, and we have a policy manual, or what we better call it, community agreements. And it includes the governance agreement as one part of it. But then there are agreements about, these are organized according to circle. But what are all the policies affecting our buildings and our grounds? What can people do to add to our houses? There are policies affecting that. The design review policy that tells people how to go through a process of, if you want to add a window to your house or build another addition or a porch to your house, there are policies that affect how that process goes. So that's design review policy. We have a common house, and there are policies affecting how we use it and how the meals happen within that. There's a community life circle, and it has a whole bunch of policies around membership, work, finances, pets and parking, etc. We have another circle, plants, animal, land stewards. They deal with the use of the community land. What's the policy around the chicken management, around how we clear brush and so on. So this is the larger picture of community agreements, what is sometimes called rules and regulations or policy manual or other names like that. What we're going to be looking at is the sample community governance agreement based upon sociocracy. This is available to you. You can look at it. You can make copies of it. You can change it, adapt it as you wish. Um, and one other aspect of this document is there's going to be a lot of words, but like what you saw before of the picture of circles, you might also eventually create a table of aims and domains of your different units of the organization. I'm not going to go through this right now, but I just want you to visually see. We have a circle. Can I see this? Sorry. Um, Maybe I can't do this. I think it's not set up in a way that I can show, but this would stroll down, and each circle has its name, what is its purpose or its aim, and what is the area of responsibility where it can make decisions, and some note about what all its subcircles or parent circles are. So a table like this can give some clarity about who has what authority. Mhm. It's a companion piece to the visual picture of the circles that you have that show your organizational structure. Okay. And if you want more detail, all this is available in the book, Many Voices, One Song, and you can go to our website for more. So this is a document that was prepared for co-housing communities in mind. So think about that as we go through it. It'll look a little different if you're going to use it for co-ops or for profits or nonprofits. The language may change a bit. Um, so preamble, table of contents, and I won't go through the table of contents because I'll just go through each piece as we go. So in the context of inviting an organization to adopt sociocracy, I've found that it's useful sometimes to just name what's the aims of governance. So a few statements about what we're trying to achieve here. And again, I'm not going to read through everything, but looking to see how our community, our organization can be effective, can have a sense of community, have a sense of egalitarianism as we do our work, and get things done. And then there is a statement of what are the principles of governance, and this is the essence of the three core elements of sociocracy. The essential statement of what are circles and how do they work. Um, here is the sort of statement about the principle of circles, that we are organized with these linked circles. Um, Language really varies from one place to another. In some communities, we call people the leaders, we call them coordinators. In other places, we call them leaders. In other places, we might call them the manager. So language changes. One of the key elements of the circle structure is the role of the leader in one circle. That leader in one circle also serves on the parent circle as a member of the parent circle. So there's an interesting question about who selects leaders. Does a parent circle select a leader for the daughter circle, or does the daughter circle select its own leader that is then confirmed by the parent circle? Either way is fine, but that is a difference that is really dependent upon the nature of the organization. Co-housing communities and more horizontal organizations, a circle usually selects its own leader, which is then confirmed by the parent circle. But in more traditional organizations, more for-profit organizations, it might be more that the parent circle selects the leader of a child circle. So that's one of those places where you start looking at which one of those would you be if you're writing your own governance agreement. What would you state here? And is either option possible, perhaps? Principle of circles. You don't, yeah. I think I'll pass this. So principle of, here's what I was talking about earlier. the importance of soliciting input. So this is part of the principle of circles, that to guide well-informed decision making, each circle solicits input. They retain authority to make decisions, but they have to solicit input. I can tell you stories of circles that adopted community that adopted sociocracy. One circle thought it had a lot of power, and they made a decision without talking to anyone, and immediately got a very strong pushback from the rest of the community. What? You did that? You know, who gave you the authority? You could just do that? And they had to work through a lot of healing from that process, and almost giving sociocracy a bad name, because some people assumed that's what it meant, that circles had authority to make decisions without without checking in. It was too much power over. Power over is checked by the gathering of input and making decisions that build trust. Not that everyone agrees with the decision, but that people in the organization trust that that circle that had that power and authority to make that decision did it in good faith, did it with a lot of deliberation, and not simply for its own benefit without thinking about the benefit of the whole. Back here. Principle of continual evolution. We'll talk more about that. Is how do you, the gathering of feedback. And as we often say, there's a couple of those slogans that we use: good enough for now, safe enough to try. You'll see those in here. One of those principles of continuous evolution is that as we grow more confident, we can give longer terms to the agreements that we make. If we're not confident, we give an agreement 6 months. If we're confident, we give an agreement 5 years. We can vary that. And as we gather feedback, we amend our policies and we grow, they become more and more effective for us. So then here we have piece around circle structure. I'm going to, so the general circle is the centerpiece of the organization. That's where all the information is flowing in and out of from the component core circles. Its major purpose is to support the well-being of its component circles, because most of the work of the organization is being done there and not in the general circle. Then there are the department circles and the sub-circles and helping circles, all those components. Here is a piece of challenge in how we conceptualize organizations. And that is the play between what we might call the full circle, meaning all the members of an organization, or the mission circle, otherwise sometimes known as the board of directors. This is a fairly complicated place, and I'll come back to it at the end of the presentation. In a co-housing context, there is usually not a powerful board of directors. It's a voluntary whole set of equals who share own homes, which means that we typically think of the community as a whole as being the most powerful group rather than a board of directors. We are not able as a whole group to make decisions usually in full circle in the community of the whole. It's too hard. If you have 40, 50 people, you cannot really do a sociocratic process. It starts reverting back to either consensus, which is too ineffective in making decisions, or then voting majority rule, which then we have winners and losers. So in the context of sociocracy in communities, yes, there is a place for a meeting of the whole, but it's limited in decision making. It's primarily a place to give feedback to the groups that are making policies. It's a place for learning about governance, for learning about communication skills, for learning about anything that is relevant to the organization. And it's a place for community building. If you're co-housing, in particular, where community building is the central purpose, then it's a time For example, what we did just yesterday in our full circle meeting of our co-housing community, uh, we spent a whole hour talking, just passing a talking stick around, and each person saying, "This is what's most deeply going in my life right now." And that's all we did around for a whole hour. The rest of the time we did teaching about how to use Google Documents because people needed to up their level of skill. And we spent some time thinking about the future of how do we support the sense of regenerative communities and are we one? So those kinds of things. The mission circle, which we like the word mission circle as opposed to board of directors, because it reminds that what is the purpose of that circle? It has to do with keeping the organization true to its mission, to its purposes. Mission circle, or typical board of directors, has people from the outside serving on it. And that is important because they're the ones who bring in a sense, the fresh air, the information that is relevant from the outside environment. Even in a co-housing community or a worker co-op, where people would say, well, why should we have any outsiders here? There is a valuable purpose to it. In a co-housing community that's got land, you might want to have a permaculture expert serving on your board, on your mission circle or your board, because they bring in that information that you may not have within your community. There may be another intentional community not too far away, and you might have somebody who's part of that community serve on your board or mission circle in order to exchange information about how do they do it, how do we do it. The board of directors of Blue Scorcher Bakery, one of the co-ops in Oregon, a Sociocratic co-op, has on its board of directors the director of the regional co-op development agency. That way, they keep informing that director about the practice of sociocracy, and that person with a larger scope learns, but that person from the development center is also bringing the experience they have from all the other co-ops in the region. The Blue Scorcher Bakery, I don't know if they do now, but at one time on their board of directors was also somebody from the local food co-op, because the local food co-op sells some of the Blue Scorcher Bakery's products. So there's a mutual benefit to serving on each other's boards. So I'll come back to some of the issues around board of directors and legalities later in the session. I'll just move on. So general framework of all circles, they all have aims and domains. Aim, purpose; domain, areas of responsibility, which is also about the limitations of your responsibility. The usual sort of simple explanations that I give are: one is financial. How much responsibility does your circle have? You can spend up to $10,000. But if you want to spend more than that, you need to ask the parent circle. Because if you spend more than that, then it has impact on other circles. But within $10,000, that's your domain. You can make the decisions. Another way of explaining that piece is being sure you have clarity of where the domain of one circle ends and another one begins. If the branch is on the tree, it belongs to landscape circle. If the branch is on the ground, it belongs to grounds circle. Simple, silly example, but being clear. If you have outreach, sales, and membership, like in a co-housing community, you're trying to outreach and get people interested. That might be one circle. Then the people who are interested, they might buy. So that's the sales circle, dealing with those people. And if they buy, then they become members. And you might have a membership circle looking at the dynamics of being a member. There's a transition from each of those. The outreach circle gives this person over to the sales circle. The sales circle processes that dynamic of buying the house, and then they pass that person on to membership circle to deal with their being a member. So that clarity of handoffs between one circle and another are things that you will wind up needing to outline in your governance agreements. Here, it's just a generic statement about that. That will come more in your table of aims and domains, for example, is where does your authority end and a different circle's authority begin. Creating and populating circles. There are many ways to do this. Circles may be, any circle can create a subcircle. Any circle can appoint someone to say, okay, Anne, you start this circle and you figure out who's going to be in it, and just give authority to make it happen that way. It's hard to talk about how to create and populate circles because there are so many different ways that that may happen. We're here, we're talking about maybe a startup organization that has 5 people in only one circle and starts growing into multiple circles. Or we're looking at an organization that has 100 people in it that wants to transition to sociocracy, and they already have a number of departments. So that's a different process. And you're going to want to talk about how you do that and what, how voluntary is circle membership. If you're in a co-housing community, that tends to be fairly voluntary, self-selection of who goes where. If you're in a for-profit organization where everybody's an employee or a worker owner, then it's much more likely that you are working, in a defined context of a working circle that has a particular purpose. So it's not as free movement as there is in a voluntary organization, perhaps. Criteria for circle membership. And again, in a worker-owned or for-profit employee context, it's you have a performance criteria, and if you don't perform, ultimately, after all the feedback that you get fired, you get let go. In a voluntary organization, you also need to have criteria for membership. We don't want circles that are simply made up of people who are just talking. It's about doing the work, which is obvious in a for-profit context, but not necessarily so obvious in volunteer contexts. You don't want people who are just there to sit and talk and have opinions. You want them to be working, because sociocracy is governance by those who associate together, who work together, who have experience in the content. And so criteria, you attend meetings, you inform if you're going to be absent. And this is a criteria that you would want to then play with your own organization. How would you say this differently if you want to? The ability to work through interpersonal conflicts might be very important. Ability to receive and give feedback. And let's see, get myself here. So, very important that a circle have the capacity to remove someone from their circle. Again, this is more of an issue in volunteer organizations where people think, oh, but shouldn't everyone be able to be here if they want to? Well, if they're working well and they're contributing to the effort, sure. But if their presence is disrupting the capacity of the circle to do its work, to contribute to accomplishing its aim, you need to have the ability to remove someone from the circle. And so you need a policy statement about that. And generally what we say is it's another, there's a process of giving feedback to support the person for well functioning. But at some point, if you get to that decision that we need to decide whether or not this person's in the circle, that's a proposal. And it goes through the standard proposal process. There's a proposal, questions for clarification, reaction round, consent. The one difference is that the person who is being proposed to be removed does not have consent rights. They obviously can't object to their own removal. Otherwise, that gives them power over the group. Ongoing learning. Ideally, circles are paying attention to their ongoing learning. And I generally think of it as those 3 areas: communication, interpersonal relationships, like nonviolent communication, for example, the governance structure and meeting processes. So continually learning about how we operate sociocratically. Particularly in organizations that have turnover, new people joining, you want to keep that process going of orienting new people, supporting their learning the process. And of course, there's ongoing learning about whatever the organization of the particular circle is involved with, whether it's bookkeeping or repairing machines, etc. I shared earlier about the feedback cycle of gathering information, so that's key. Um, and circles and organization has its logbook, and so you need to make some statements about how the logbook functions and who keeps it up. Logbook meaning the policy manual or the collection of all the decisions or the information base of the organization. Then, um, particularly again in intentional communities where people might think they can go everywhere and just show up at meetings just because they care about a topic, you need to have a policy about visitors attending your circle meetings. So a potential policy is that, yes, people are welcome to come and they can participate in opening and closing rounds of the circle, but they can't just simply participate in the rest of the meeting without the consent of the members of the circle. So the members in the circle can decide, hey, yes, why don't you participate, almost fully in the meeting? Even if there's a consent round, you can say, if you had consent rounds, what would you say? So you can even welcome visitors to go all the way to that level of participation. Or you can say, we have a very busy agenda. You may observe, but please, you're not going to be speaking unless we directly ask you to give some input. You may have a policy, for example, that allows a visitor to come and speak at the beginning of the meeting about what's important to them. They get heard, but then you go on with your agenda because the circle is responsible for its agenda and you don't want to give power over your agenda over to a visitor. Otherwise, you may not get your work done. So circle member roles, I'm not going to go into depth on that because hopefully most of you are familiar with those things. Coordinator, delegate, facilitator, secretary, logbook keeper. One that I'll mention because it's not often thought about is a community reporter. One of my frequent comments about sociocracy is that with dispersed authority, it's hard to know what's going on in the whole organization. So there's a couple of elements that would be really useful. One is who speaks to what's going on in the organization in the whole, in the big picture. It's kind of what's the state of the organization this month? What are the major issues that we're facing? How are we dealing with them? Where are we going? That's often a role of a leader of the organization, the executive director, or somebody in that kind of a role to be making that statement and supporting the sense of connection, unity of the whole. Another element of communication is what's going on in each of these little circles. They're all doing stuff, but how do we track that? So some way of gathering the key elements of what's going on in the different parts of the organization and being able to give that information over to the group as a whole so that you know what's going on over there. And if what's going on over there impacts you or you have a strong opinion about it, you're able to find a way to communicate because you have enough information that you're able to do that. When you get to every circle has its own leader, coordinator, whichever word you use, and they may have some authority to make decision in between meetings. If they do, then they are responsible for having made that decision back to their home circle. The coordinator of the general circle sometimes has a particular role because they are relating back to the community as a whole. So some of what I was just saying, communicating the state of the community, or they may have a particular role in supporting meetings of the full community, of the whole organization, the occasional whole organization meetings. Then there's a whole section on decision making, which again I won't go into in detail. This is sort of the basics of sociocracy. What are the elements in decision making? In whose domain is this decision? So if an idea comes up in your own circle, you need to assess: is this our decision to make, or is this particular issue belong somewhere else? One key piece here: inability to reach consent. If the circle is struggling and not able to make a decision, then the delegator or the coordinator, based on their own judgment, can bring that proposal or issue to the next broader circle for input and perhaps decision. So you do not have to have consent within a circle that you are unable to reach a decision, because that becomes parliamentary procedure. It's like if somebody, well, I don't consent that we haven't made a decision, means you can keep it stuck and not being able to move forward. So we always want to be able to free up the possibility of action. If things are too stuck, then go to the parent circle is responsible for helping move the thing forward, either making decision on their own or giving enough input that might assist the child circle to move forward. What's the basis of objections? The core basis of objection is always around the ability to accomplish aims. If we say yes to this, will our ability to accomplish the aim be harmed or interfered with? Anytime there is an objection, you are thinking of it as a gift, as something that will help us come up with a way of being even more effective at accomplishing our aim. And they're not going to go into it, but that's the whole distinction between personal preferences and range of tolerance in the context of decision making. Here's a little policy that you may need to make. This is not necessarily obvious, but what happens when somebody's absent? If we are saying that decisions in a circle are made by consent of its members, and a member is absent, now what? Is it decision by consent of the members present, or by the members, period? We don't want to be in a situation of like, oh, CJ is going to be absent from this meeting. Quick, let's make a decision on this topic that he objects to. Since he's not there, we can just make a decision by consent of those present. Well, that's not going with the spirit. So if when a person's going to be absent, A, they're informing the circle they're going to be absent. B, if they have an opinion about the topic that's at hand, they could share that ahead of time. And you can have other ways of stating the policy that, yeah, we'll make a decision, but then anybody who is absent has 24 hours to say, wait a minute, can we discuss this? So what's the policy for absent members? And there's some wording there that we've got as an option. And then, of course, how do you appeal decisions? This is usually core, particularly in co-housing communities, to go from a consensus process where everybody has a say to a consent process where distributed authority means the individual, in a sense, loses some power, because the individual has a lot of power in consensus in a whole community meeting, and has less power in sociocracy, where decisions are made in the groups. So you need a process for appealing decisions. Typically, the original standard in sociocracy is within your own circle, you can bring up concern or objection to what's going on in any other circle, and then bring that concern either horizontally to the other circle or vertically to the parent circle. Or you can have some policy where some number of individuals of the organization or the community can object and bring their concern to the circle and go through the process. Clarity about how you're producing minutes. I won't go into that in detail here. Clarity about your process of evaluating, amending, reaffirming this very document itself, the governance agreement or any of its practices. So do you have some way of reviewing and looking at the quality of your governance? And again, I won't go into the details here, but there's some sample language. And this brings me to the near to the end, where the complications, where the more complicated things are. And again, this we might be able to do with some questions, but it's is how are you going to frame your mission circle or board of directors? What's the highest, quote unquote, highest body uh, in your organization? And this varies differently, and what authority you give to it varies differently, because you're a sociocratic organization. You can make decisions to to determine that on your own. We have to deal with the laws of our governments, provincial, local, national, and sometimes they seem to restrict us. It is my understanding, my sense that there's always a way around whatever the governmental law is, a way to be within the spirit of the law, but also true to the mission of sociocracy of being able to work in an egalitarian, in a way that really represents egalitarian function. um, so there's this question about the board of directors, and this is again oriented towards co-housing community, um, where by law in the United States, if you're a condominium, the the uh, the the full community meeting is made up of the homeowners. But in a community is made up of more people than just homeowners. It includes maybe the partner, the lover of a homeowner who's been living there for years, but whose name is not on the deed. Or it may be the adult child or the parent of someone who lives there. Or it may be a renter in the house who is a very active community participant. So in that context, the community members are a greater body than the technical homeowners. And so you want to think about how you craft your wording of, of governance in the community to include those people if that's what you want to be doing. Um, so it changes the nature of how you identify who the board of directors is, what's its location in the organizational structure, what are its powers, what are the powers of a board of directors in relationship to any powers that the whole community as a full circle might still have, or relating to the powers that the general circle as the coordinating group might have. And we can get into some of that detail with questions and answers, but I'm just pointing out those things. The and one comment again in a context of co-housing, for example, when you have a full community meeting, what might their powers be? It could be significant and permanent changes to the physical community. We're going to buy another piece of land. We're going to build, another 2 or 3 buildings. We're going to change our governance structure. Um, we're going to do something that really impacts financially the members of the community. uh, the annual budget. So those are significant changes that may be by law given to the full circle or the owners of the community, whatever the ruling body technically according to the law is. There are a couple of things to think about that. One is that you do ultimately need to have a fallback for whatever, like it does, even in sociocracy, there might need to be a fallback. If the highest body of the organization is not able to make a decision, then what happens? That you may have a fallback of going to a supermajority vote, like a 2/3 or 3/4, or you may give the decision making to a council of elders, or some other process so that you can get past that moment of inability to make decisions. That is a pretty rare occurrence. I actually don't really know of any community or organization that has hit that moment, but it is useful to have some fallback in your documentation. Um, and there are usually some legal requirements about that. One other thing I want to say here about, and this again would require more conversation. Um, and actually, I think I'll wait. I'll make a note and comment on this. If I don't say it, remind me. Community of the whole and consent agenda are two particular pieces that are useful in some contexts. And I'll come back to those. And see, getting near the end here. This is a bit of what I already talked about before, of the distinction between membership and participation in governance. How do you define your members? And how do you define your members is going to be a key issue no matter what organization that you're in. Who are the members? What are the rights and responsibilities of membership? And you have different classes of members, whether it's a co-housing community where you have renters and homeowners, or whether you are a for-profit organization and you've got investors and workers, etc. And finally, any implementation of sociocracy would often require the support of an implementation circle to bring the process of exploration of wondering, should we adopt sociocracy or not, having a smaller group that is tailoring like this document to the particular organization, that is doing some education of the organization in preparation for the decision of whether or not to adopt sociocracy. After adoption of sociocracy, to have a circle that is continuing to support the well-functioning of the organization. You know, these are your sociocratic experts who can support the different circles of the organization if they are struggling, who can do a facilitation workshop or get together the secretaries of the organization to streamline and improve documentation practices, etc. So having an ongoing unit of the organization that is paying attention to the well-functioning of the governance of the organization is important. So this is all the governance document, and then you may have some appendices. The meeting and decision guide, if you haven't seen that, we have those on our sociocracyforall.org website. You know, what are the steps of process of, what's the standard meeting process? What is the process of generating decisions, generating proposals, and what's the process of coming to consent on decisions? Those are an outline of that. Is really critical for an organization, particularly when it's starting out, until they get their habits in place. The visual organizational structure diagram, so you can see the circles and how they're connected to each other. The table of the aims and domains, like I showed you briefly before. There may be some other things like the communication example. This particular weekly communication example is an idea taken from one co-housing community, where every week they would publish a one-page bulletin with a note from each of the circles saying what we want you to know about what we're doing. And it would give just a 1 or 2 liner about the policies that we're examining or decisions that were made or things that were coming up. And then you could click on a link to get more information. So this was one of the ways of dealing with the information flow. And so you might create something like that. Logbook example, how does the organization have all its files? You know, we tend to use Google Docs because it's moderately easy and many people are familiar with it. So you have a nested series of folders, a folder for the general circle, and a folder for the buildings and grounds circle, and so on, where you keep your minutes and information knowledge base that's relevant to your circle. So helping the organization start up with a useful logbook framework, policy manual. The feedback loops diagram, I showed you that earlier, that helps people understand that they still have voice even though you've distributed authority. I gave you an example of community agreements policies, as I sort of walked through that. That's another document. Often, as you're starting out in a co-housing community context or others, you need to understand how you're going to hold your general policy manual of your organization. And some organizations find it important, useful to have a values statement. I have mixed opinions about that, partly coming from a workshop I once went to where they showed us the value statement of an organization, and we all went, wow, what a wonderful set of values. And then we found out that the organization itself was called Enron, which, for those of you who are around, was one of the most unethical organizations ever created. But they had a wonderful set of stated values. And that's it. I'm going to stop share. If anybody needs the link, the link to that document is in the chat, but if anybody's come lately, let's see if I can put it in there again. Yeah, so I'm re-putting that link into the chat for anybody who came late and maybe didn't see that. That's all I want to say. So maybe you've taken some notes or things are popping out for you, or things like, what about this? Or tell me more about that. And that's what we'll spend the balance of our hour, the next hour or so together. Maybe it's because I'm not the host.
Okay, I think we're unmuted now.
Yes, you are. Great.
This is Chris, part of the Kawartha Commons group. And lots of information here that I've taken notes on in terms of things we need to do. We are a Sociocracy implementation circle in a forming co-housing group. So we are a lot of sort of forming issues and questions here. We've been discussing putting the Sociocracy implementation circle as a sub-circle of our legal circle, and in your example, you put the Sociocracy implementation circle as a sub-circle of what we call our coordinating circle. And I was wondering if you could talk to the question of which might be a better choice for us.
Mm-hmm. Well, on one hand, I want to say it doesn't really matter. What matters is what the circle is going to do. The governance improvement circle is kind of a unique kind of circle because it doesn't have an ongoing piece of work as much as an input that it wants to have on the whole. Are you okay? You having troubles hearing? Or?
Okay, here.
It's okay. We just have a box on the screen. We're trying to get it.
Click on the box.
Just on the corner.
Right there. Thank you.
We're good. Thank you.
We're good. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. In a forming community, you know, your legal circle, let me put it this way. Once you exist, legal issues are fairly minor. So legal issues get buried somewhere. You know, in our community, legal issues are with finance and legal, which is a sub-circle of community life, which is a sub-circle of our coordinating circle. Because legal issues only arise if you get sued, which is pretty rare. And even finances is just gathering information. It's not really a core working group. It's just gathering information from the different circles. So I wouldn't want to go through legal in order to get the ear of your coordinating group. In a forming organization, the implementation circle has to be very close to the heart, to wherever the communication central is, because you've got a lot of work to do. You know, you're creating the cultural context of the whole community. The decision making, along with the way you talk to each other, is the culture that you will create. So I want that close to the coordinating circle, so that you make sure that the agendas represent sociocratic style of how you do your meetings, that you're ensuring that the structure you're creating is allowing for the voices of, you know, like, where's the newcomer's voice? Where's the not yet ready to fully commit voice? Where's the I'm all the way in voice? and they each should have some way to having some voice, but within limits according to their commitment.
Okay.
That answer?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So I will go around then to Roberto and Jess. I don't know if you missed it before. I'm just going around and seeing, do you have a question or a comment that you would like to make? And we're going to go around with everybody present and even do a second round as time allows.
Yes, well, I just wrote a question from your experience. How do organizations moving towards sociocracy go about defining their own agreement? Do they set up a committee? Do they have a workshop? Do they have a voting procedure? Practically.
It varies a lot. And the reason we wrote this document is to make it easier. Because the first number of communities had to invent every single word of these documents. And then when you have to invent every word, you start really spending a lot of time with editing and with, but this, but that, but Jerry said this, but this other trainer said that. You can get into a lot of, a lot of spins into nowhere. So my recommendation is take this, particularly if you're a co-housing community, this is pretty well organized towards co-housing, take this document and then go through it and say, is there any change that we would like to make given our particular context? And maybe you adopt it pretty much the way this is, and maybe you make some changes, but I would say start from this so it'll make your life a lot easier. And you can give a sample document like this to everyone in the community and say, we're going to start from this document. And our circle, our implementation circle is going to gather your input. So please read this document and give us your feedback about what you like or don't like about this document. We'll take in your feedback and we'll craft a proposal for our community. Does that respond to you, Roberto?
Makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to Jess and then Irena.
Yay. My thought was, are these governance documents as transparent among other organizations? So my first thought was like, oh, I wonder if there are other sociocratic running organizations related to digital marketing or publishing or incubators or things like that. And then I wondered, well, would they be so willing to share their documents as you are sharing them? Is there, is that common that, there might be people would be willing to share their documents that are not co-housing?
Good question. There's a lot of the history of sociocratic organizations is still relatively short. People who do sociocratic organizations don't necessarily think about, oh, I'm going to publicize my bylaws or my my governance agreements to other people, because that's not their purpose. With Sociocracy for All, our purpose is to try to share samples. So that is our purpose. So we want to be collecting those. So there's not a whole lot that's been collected yet. The standard, something like this is a pretty good standard for most kinds of organizations. What you're going to get into that's more specific is with your particular industry. What are the, like if you're an accounting organization, you're going to have some policies that relate to that field of accounting in which you're working. And so those policies we don't have samples of. But there are the Blue Scorcher Bakery. I think their bylaws or their governance agreement is public. Hopefully in the next number of months, Sociocracy for All is gathering more samples and we'll make those available to you. There are other samples in John Buck and Sharon Valines' book, We the People, which is available online in ebook format, and they've got sample governance agreements or things that you can use as bylaws there as well. Sociocracy for All is in a dialogue right now with a number of people talking about bylaws and how to frame them, how to bridge between this document that you've seen here and the laws in countries. So that's a process that we're working on. Hopefully we'll have some product out of that in the next few months. And then there's yet even another whole process, which Jess is part of, to even, think on a whole different scale. But I won't get into that. Again, you'll get more information about that as we go along, as we generate things. Enough there, Jess? You good? Irena, and then Ruth.
Yes, I have one question. You mentioned the classes of members. I was wondering how it is, how it affects the members' activities in circles, the decision power. Maybe you could illustrate it with some example.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll give two kinds of examples. There's the co-housing community example, and I mentioned some of that earlier. I'm a homeowner, so that, I have certain rights and responsibilities as a homeowner. Ted lives with me here. Ted is not a homeowner, but he is a member of the community, because we define membership as those who are willing to work and participate in the work of the community. So even though Ted is not a legal signer of a deed, ownership of the house, we define membership as including the people who have said, yes, we're in. We have something we call associate members, people who live across the street from us. And they have certain rights and responsibilities, that they can participate in the life of the community, in the governance of the community. Technically speaking, they don't have the right to object to our budget, because they're not a homeowner, they're across the street. But we actually, in practice, we invite them to participate as much as they want. But technically speaking, they wouldn't have that right. There are people who, there's some of us have a renter in our house who's like a graduate student, who does not participate in anything in the community. They simply live here. They go to school and come back, go to school and come back. So they do not have, for example, the right to hold a party in our community building, because they are not a member of the community. They're not supporting all the work of keeping that building clean and functioning. So that's where you start defining what are the rights and responsibilities of people who are just renting, people who are associates, people who are who are opt-in members, people who are on the deed owners. Then the other aspect would be, for example, a cooperative or a for-profit. I'll just take a cooperative, for example. A worker co-op may have worker owners, and they may have people who are not yet worker owners. They have to work there for a year before they can become a worker owner. So they are workers. They have a voice in the decision making as a worker in a circle, but they may not have decision making in the circle where their worker owners have their worker ownership hat on. In a for-profit organization, there may be investors, and the investors are not workers, or at least the hat where they're wearing as investors. They may have a say as an investor circle, and they may have delegate serving on the board of directors of the organization. But they don't have any say in the work process that all the workers have within the worker circle structure that defines what the workers are doing within each of the circles. The investors only have a say in the board of directors, where they are another equal voice to the voice of the workers or other members of that circle. Yeah, that's another version of that would be a nonprofit where they have volunteers. And so the volunteers may have a circle where they have a voice as volunteers, but the volunteers may also be members of working circles, mixed in with staff doing the work of the organization. In a school, there might be a parents' circle that has a voice again, at the level of the board of directors, the mission circle of the school, because the parents are the primary customers of the school, in a sense. So they have a voice at that level. And again, as parents, they may have a voice because they're also in some working as volunteers in some unit of the school. Is that helpful, Irina? Okay. Okay. I'll go on. Ruth, you have a question? I like you have your little flap to prevent the government from seeing you all the time. You're muted, Ruth.
Okay.
There
we go.
Yes.
Yeah, I really don't have any questions right now. I'll pass. Thank you.
Okay, great to see you for a moment. We'll move on. I've got Timo and then CJ. Timo, do you have any questions you want to ask at this point? You can pass. And
second, yes. Yeah, my question would be, what are so the thing I understood, all these different groups of people you just explained, they would be elected into circles through a role selection process, something like this, and these circles would then basically define the rights and expectations towards these people. Is that how you practically handle it?
Okay, that's a complex question. Let me step back for a moment. To give an example, for our community, we have been around for 25 years. So when we adopted Sociocracy about 8 or 9 or 10 years ago, we already existed. We already had a membership circle, and we still have a membership circle that now operates sociocratically. So that circle has the authority and responsibility to determine membership policy. What I was mentioning before about what are the rights and responsibilities of the different kinds of members. That circle is self-selected. They have selected themselves to be there. They've agreed that they would work together. They are a sub-circle of my circle, community life. And they select among themselves for the roles that they play in their own circle. Who is going to be their leader? Who's going to be their facilitator, secretary, delegate? So they make those own selections. Now, if you step back into another context as well, who decides who's going to be a member of any circle? And again, there's a variety of how people do that. Either self-selection, you just show up, I'd like to be a member of this circle. Do you welcome me? Yes, great. Or no, you're too difficult a person. We don't want you here. Whatever the response is. This is in voluntary systems. There's another approach in a voluntary system where everybody gathers and then you kind of nominate or you do a process of selecting who is going to be a member of every single circle of the organization. Or you can go through a process of saying, who are the leaders of the core circles, and let them decide who they're going to invite to be members of their circle. If you have a for-profit organization, you already have circles in place and people are there by virtue of their employment. And so when you have a new hire, that person is being hired into an existing circle. Is that helpful? Timo, do you want to follow up with a question? Make sure I understood what you were asking for.
Yeah, it was very helpful. So somebody would be hired into a circle, or somebody would also be, or joining a circle would also be part of the rental process. When you rent out an apartment or something, then someone would also have to agree to being part of the circle of renters, right? And perhaps also be accepted by the circle of renters.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that leads me to another clarification that I think is useful. particularly in the co-housing or voluntary organization context. There's a difference between operations and policy. So circles are about making policy, but there's a lot more operations that happen than just making policy. So, for example, I occasionally wash dishes in our community meal. And but there's very little policy making to do. Maybe once a year dishwashers could get together and say, is there a better detergent that we should use? But they don't really make much policy. They're just doing operations, washing dishes several times a week, wash, wash, wash. So in our community, everyone who is a member makes a commitment to do work. So everybody's got to do washing dishes or cleaning the common house or mowing the lawns or doing whatever is needed, fixing things. But it is not required that everybody be involved in a circle. Circle is about governance. So the circle determines the policies about the meal system, the dishwashing system, etc. And if you're not part of that circle, then you're not making decisions about that. There's only a few people that decide, the dynamics of meals and dishwashing, but there's lots of people who take their turns cooking and dishwashing. But only if they choose to be in the policy-making level of that are they involved in that. Now, obviously, if the circle that has to deal with dishwashing is going to examine policy, they're going to want to survey or talk to the dishwashers and say, from your experience, is there something that you want to offer that would make, our system of dishwashing even better than it is? So that's where the input comes in. So I'm not completely sure I'm accurately answering the questions you're raising, but now what's coming up for you?
I think so. I'm not completely sure either, but that was very interesting and insightful anyway, so thank you.
Okay, we'll go on to some others and we may come back if you've got more questions that come up. CJ and then Anne.
Hey, I've got a couple of questions that I put in the chat, but I can speak them just in case for folks who haven't read them. There's three, actually, a few. So the first question is...
Let's take them one at a time.
Yeah, the first question is, I work with a community organization, and some people in the organization are paid, but a lot of the governance stuff is actually volunteer. But it takes a lot of work to follow up after meetings and stuff like that. So at some points in our organization's history, we've kind of parsed down our governance because it can be expensive and time consuming or complicated. And there's also that idea that some people express about when they look at the ballooning cost of government in America or something, it's like, wow, they're getting paid how much? And so I'm just curious about the amount of energy that goes into say writing all of these agreements and the whole governance process, and how to balance the amount of work that goes in, because I feel like it's the kind of thing where you could pour hours and hours into writing a detailed governance document, and then it's how useful is it and where's the balance? And I'm just curious about thoughts on how to decide how much work to put into it so that you're not kind of doing governance for the sake of governance or something.
I think my simple answer is you want to do the least possible.
Yeah.
What's the least amount of work that gets you moving? Mm-hmm. Are you, for example, why reinvent the wheel? Just adopt this policy and try it out for 6 months and a year, and then see, well, are there any pieces of this that aren't quite working that we could just tweak? Great, it's just a small tweak.
Yeah.
Again, we wrote this policy as a sample so that people just don't start reinventing the wheel. Good governance is invisible.
Yeah.
It just happens. A car that works well just goes down the road. And you don't need to know all the details of how the motor works and how it transfers energy to the wheels. It's well designed and it just happens. So once getting people to follow a process of rounds instead of interrupting each other can take months, because people aren't used to doing that. But once you're used to doing that, you're not putting any more effort into it. You just go, okay, next, 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 boom, 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 and everybody speaks, and you just move through it really quickly. And it's from my experience, it's much more effective than the popcorn way of talking. But it's a cultural change, so that the cultural change does take effort. And and generally, putting attention to governance is highly dependent upon the level of trust within the group. If there's really low trust, you're going to spend hours and hours and hours arguing about things because people are afraid they're somehow going to lose power. If there's high trust, you just whip something out and say, hey, good enough now, let's try it. And if it doesn't work, then we'll just fix it. Not a big deal. It's a big deal if there is tension about issues of power. And when you're shifting from consensus to consent, from a historical consensus process to adopting sociocracy, there's often issues of power that come up for people. People are afraid of losing power, and for right reasons. We live in cultures where power over has been abused so much. And so that's part of those, those slogans that we keep saying: good enough for now, safe enough to try. Let's learn by doing. Let's not try to get everything perfect, because by the time we get it perfect, we'll be so worn out we won't do anything. There are, in my experience, kind of two classes of people that object to transition to sociocracy, particularly from consensus to sociocracy. And that is the people as individuals who have had a lot of power within a consensus process because they speak a lot, they speak loudly, they speak often, they are problematic people, perhaps, difficult to deal with. And so people don't want to fight, people are conflict avoidant, they let those people have their power, they don't challenge them so much. When you adopt sociocracy, that person becomes one person in a circle and is around, and they can't simply dominate the group in the way that you can in a context where a whole group meeting of 40 people happens and that one person repeats themselves and maybe gets loud or speaks in a way that other people are intimidated by. Now they become one person in a circle, and now there's a whole lot more feedback. So that person is being repeatedly told, like the way you participate is causing pain and difficulty for others. Could you lower your tone? Could you shorten your speech? And they're getting feedback that hopefully helps them be a more effective and more collaborative participant. But that person may have some challenges in adopting sociocracy. And if they can live through it, they'd be really grateful at the end for what they've learned and how they've become a more enjoyable person to be with in the community than they were before. Because they found a place to contribute without overbearing on others. The other sometimes challenge comes from people who hold consensus as a quasi-religious perspective. This is the truth and the way, and there can be no other way. Sometimes it's actually Quakers in organizations who hold that line. And sociocracy is built upon, the principle of egalitarianism that comes from the Quakers. But sometimes people who have a particular frame, it's hard for them to see that sociocracy is a practice of consensus. Just it's a very detailed, to really support a greater sense of egalitarianism that is often practiced with the way people do consensus. On the other side, you have when you're going from power, from a hierarchical system to adopting sociocracy, the challenges there might be that those who traditionally have power are nervous about sharing it. And on the other hand, people who traditionally haven't had power are nervous about taking it on. If you've been a worker who showed up 9 to 5 and never had to take responsibility for the whole before, it's like, oh, now you're asking me to take responsibility? That's scary. Yes, it's scary. Take a breath. We'll do it together. I don't know if that responded to you, CJ?
Yeah, and more a little bit, but that's great.
Yeah, give a speech.
Yeah. So there's two more questions, and they're a little bit interconnected. The second one is like the community that I'm most involved in is a dance community where our membership, or like the attendees of the dance, are kind of very fluid, like different people attend every week. People may move here and then become a real member of the community. Other people, they might have been here for years and they ebb and flow. And so we kind of have had this dilemma around more open circles or like the full membership. And I imagine it might be similar for like a housing co-op that rents houses or rents rooms in a house or something, where like some members might be new or only living there for a year, whereas other people are like owners or something. So I'm curious about thoughts on circle structures that can really support participation and really invite participation. So yeah, like I see the full circle as a model with like feedback learning, community building, and decision making as different components of it. And yeah, I'm just curious about thoughts around this, like more amorphous and fluid membership versus more structured.
I'll answer you. So sociocracy, decisions made by those who work together. It depends upon relationship that has continuity. It depends upon that dialogue that happens when people work together a period of time. So drop-in membership, as a decision-making member of a circle, I'd say, nope, you don't want to do that. You're just opening yourself up to chaos. You can have, this is the one-to-many problem that any kind of platform cooperative or platform organization would have, where a few people are kind of managing, but there are many users who are also contributors. So you want to create a kind of an open structure of, okay, anybody who wants to have, of our dancers come together and we'll get, we'll pose some questions, we'll gather some input from you. And if you want, you can select some people who will serve as a delegate or as members of an ongoing circle that represents the point of view of the participants as dancers. So you have an ongoing circle that has a strong relationship with getting feedback from an open gathering of people. That's how I would do that.
Yeah, that sounds basically like what we've decided to do most recently. So that's nice. Mm-hmm. Cool. The last question that I have is is around privilege and race and class and stuff like that. In that I notice, there's a lot of space for deciding like who can be on a circle and who can't, which totally makes sense because like you don't want to have people who don't even live there making decisions about something or whatever. But it could also be something that like enforces privilege around race or class or access to resources. Something that comes to mind is even just education. Like sometimes people struggle with, say, the word governance or with the complexity of decision making, which on one hand, like you need to have a level of understanding to make good decisions, but it also could be a limiting factor for participation. So I'm curious about this perspective of like how to really have inclusivity and to counteract social and racial privilege and stuff like that.
Good. Several things to say about that. One is part of the commitment in a sociocratic organization is continuing education. So that's continuing education about governance. And you can do workshops, you can just teach as you go. In my experience with people with maybe limited education who participate in sociocratic processes, they do just fine when they're getting information as we go. Because their ethical structure is as good as anybody else's, they just don't have some of the language. But if they are led in a facilitative process, they can be great participants. Continuing education for everybody in the organization to understand the historical dynamics of race and class and gender and all the other ways that privilege some people over others. As we are conscious of that, that will help everyone. And that sociocracy itself, and especially along with processes or communication skills like nonviolent communication, are about equivalence of voice. So it means everyone gets a turn. And you don't have to fight against the people who tend to dominate. And you start out perhaps kind of shy, your voice has never mattered before, and you don't know if your voice matters now. Again, over some period of time, you start coming to realize that your voice does matter. You find more of your voice. In the same way that the person from privilege who always had their way, who always talked a lot, finds that they can just keep quiet and listen to other people speak first. And they don't always have to be the first and last to speak and the one who did. So it's that going around is really critical to equalizing voice. And it does take some time and consciousness to support people claiming their full voice. That's basically I have you know, this whole issue of diversity and inclusion, equity is really important. And what I find is that many of the organizations who are conscious of that are not egalitarian. So yes, then it becomes a real issue of how do you have diversity, inclusion, and equity in organizations that are not egalitarian? It's really difficult because they keep reinforcing power over, even though they say we want your participation. So if you have a baseline of being egalitarian, that really changes the nature of the playing field.
Sweet.
All right.
Thanks.
Anne, and then Bolette.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm really happy for this document, as we will hopefully grow from 10 people to 100 in the next few years. So we have something to start out with. My question is really, really simple. Where do I find the other good documents, like the table, the appendices?
Mm-hmm.
Are there links to them?
There is, well, the little slideshow that I did will be available to you. And we are, this is, you know, we're continually trying to get some of these documents put together and make them available to you. They'll be available on the website as we develop them. The chart of decision making, that's already on our website. I don't know if the sample table of aims and domains is available on the website, but it's available on Google Docs for you because you're a member of SOFA. So if you're a member of the organization, you can dance around. It's a little work to find things sometimes, but part of our challenge is how much we produce and trying to curate all these pieces and to make them easily available to others. So that's as good as an answer as I've got right now for you.
Okay, thank you.
Ask for the specifics, and we can probably get you a copy of the specifics while we are not yet ready to have it on a public place, more easily accessible. Because public place also means that we want the quality of it to be a little bit better than we often have. Bolette, and then Brian. If not, Brian's not here, then Linda. Bolette.
Thanks. I don't have a question right now. I'm listening and enjoying the conversation. Check.
Okay. Brian, if you're here, and if not, to Linda. I think I saw Linda had a question somewhere. Brian. No, Brian. Linda?
Hi, I just have a couple of questions, mainly from a legal point of view, because that's sort of where my thoughts automatically go. One of the things in the UK, in terms of this governance document, we would probably refer to it as a set of regulations or a set of secondary rules that underpin the governing document of the organisation that's legally registered. And those types of things we would expect to see in there in terms of the detail. And I was just interested, and I would be interested to learn more about how the two may interact with one another. So if you have a incorporation document, I don't know what they're called in the US, but in the UK, it's sort of articles of association, sort of how the two would interact. So I'd be really interested in sort of hearing more, whether any work's been done on that. The other question I had was about being a sociocratic organisation that works in a world of external regulators. And my experience is that external regulators will want to pin the responsibility on a specific decision-making forum within an organisation. And usually that is the board. So my question was, how do you manage that struggle between having a mission circle, whether that's the board or whatever, who seem to hold the responsibility, even though the power is shared to other circles? Because ultimately, if you're looking at a bank, they'll want to know who the board is. If you're looking at a lender, they'll want to know who the directors are. So it was just that idea really about the struggle between power and responsibility, because ultimately an external stakeholder will want to pin that responsibility on a group of people, and whether that's been a tension point within the sociocratic community really. So couple of questions.
It's in a sense, it's not so much a tension around what we want, but it is a tension of that we haven't, there's a lot of documentation that needs to be produced to make it easier. And every country's got its different ways of doing it. So we want to create legal documents that protect sociocracy so that it can't be simply taken over by some other governance system like majority rule, and that give authority, that clearly do give authority to the board of directors, so that the external regulators and so on, what they see matches is close enough to their expectations so that they're willing to go with it. That's one way of saying it. I mean, we do also need to do some work in changing the regulations so that sociocratic organizations are just, oh, of course, you're a sociocratic organization, no problem. That's part of, we understand that as a way of doing things. And so there is a play of what do you put into the more legalistic statement, like in what I would generally call the bylaws, versus what you put into the governance agreement. One of the simple statements in the bylaws is, and see the rules and regulations, or see the community agreements, or see the governance agreements for, the more detail. And so you have the more detail there, which is not what regulators tend to look at. It's not what they are, they don't need to see that stuff. That's your own internal policies. So I don't think I have a good answer to that yet, because we're still working on that. We actually have a working group just now starting to meet about that and trying to sort out and come up with something like this template that we've come up with for governance agreements, but are more that bridge of, what are the legal statements that we can make that will meet the needs of the bankers, the lenders, the regulators, and also protect the sociocratic process. So I don't have more of an answer than that at the moment, Linda.
Right, thanks.
In process. Terry and Audrey?
Hi, I just have a question about under the additional notes, there's a list of 6 options for the board of directors, and I'm wondering if you can just share a little bit more thoughts about why an organization might do one of those options over another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this this is a question in particular towards co-housing communities, which of which there are, the main form of co-housing communities in the United States is a condominium, and the secondary form that sometimes they are is a cooperative. When it's a condominium, generally there's a law that you have to have a board of directors that is controlled by the homeowners. That's not in the spirit of what co-housing is. We don't want co-housing to be controlled by the homeowners. We want the co-housing to be controlled by the community members, which is a larger group than just the homeowners. And we want it to be sociocratic. So in that context, different communities have done different things. There is at least one community that has defined the board of directors as the entire the entire community. The benefit of that is that they don't have to worry about some smaller group having power where they don't want to share power. The challenge is that anything comes up to that group is going to be hard for them to make decisions because it goes to everybody. Some communities have a board of directors essentially in name only. That's our community where I live. Every year we elect our board of directors, or we just say, yeah, sure, those same 7 people can be the board of directors yet again. They have never, in a sense, formally met in 25 years because we've never had to call on them, because the only reason we'd call on them is if we had some legal requirement to do so, like if we got sued. But we've never been sued. And so, yes, somebody in that board of directors is legally the treasurer and they sign the document. Somebody is legally the president. And so there's some documents to sign, but those are already have been approved by appropriate circles who have responsibility in that area. So it's you know, if we meet the letter of the law, we can defend it. We have minutes that we can show. Any meeting of the coordinators or of the full circle, when they meet, we can always do, this refers actually to the comment I was going to make before, and it's more complicated than we have time to explain, but the community of the whole, the committee of the whole is when you have a lot of people present who are not necessarily the decision makers, but you want to include them all. So the committee of the whole essentially makes a recommendation, which then gets rubber stamped by the smaller subset of people who are also present in the room, who are the board of directors. So I think the Declaration of, I don't know if it's a Declaration of Independence or maybe it was the Constitution of the United States, there were more people in the room than were delegates. The committee of the whole made a decision which was rubber stamped by the actual formal delegates. And so that's the notion of the committee of the whole, and it goes with it is the consent agenda, that when the board of directors goes to make a decision coming off the recommendation of the committee of the whole, they have what's called a consent agenda, a list of items, and they simply say, do we consent to all these items as stated? Yes, done. 5 minutes, you consent to all those items that took maybe hours for other people to come up with. But they're basically just rubber stamping what's been already decided or recommended by others. They don't need to discuss them. They're meeting the letter of the law. And they're holding a responsibility for having done that. But they are part of the community, so they've been involved in all those kinds of discussions that led to those decisions. It's not like a complete divorced thing. Another community has its board of directors as the coordinators group, because that's where a lot of the information is held together. The challenge there is that there's a fair amount of turnover as people get selected in and out of being leaders and delegates. So it's in dealing with stability of a board, it's a little bit more challenging. Another community has its board of directors as one of the sub-circles of the coordinators group. It's actually like the buildings and grounds group is the board of directors, because they have a relationship with maybe a management company or with the with the legal aspects of things. And so that's in their domain, and they hold that in for the benefit of the whole. So that's another doable thing. There's more to be said perhaps about that, but I think that's all we have time for. So that was coming from Terry. Did you have another question there, Terry? Or
No, I'm good. Thank you.
okay, Audrey, if I'm saying your name right, or whoever you're
surprisingly well.
Good.
I just want to give gratitude for all you get available for free and all of the work that Sociocracy for All does. Thank you. And Tom's has a question.
Yeah, and congratulations on the fundraiser.
Yeah, thank you. Anybody wants to give more money, we're sure more.
Yes. On one note that came up, I was talking with a sociocratic nerd friend this morning who lives at Findhorn, and they let me know that in Holland, businesses who identify as sociocratic don't need to have unions. So they might have some legal frameworks around official sociocratic documentation. But my personal question was, we work with the Global Eco-Village Network, and there's one of the communities that's reached out to me recently about trying to implement sociocracy. They have so much enthusiasm, and they're just exploding with so much great energy, but they're kind of trying to integrate so many different projects they already have started that they have various levels of influence in, like a farm that they're kind of partnering but aren't necessarily owning, and then a community school that they're starting up but aren't necessarily in full dictatorship of. It's kind of a collaboration. And so they have like all of these various spheres of groups that they're part of but not aren't fully signed on yet necessarily for sociocracy. And so I wasn't sure the kind of way that their various how to operate their various circles when it's not as clearly like we are an eco-village and all of our stuff comes out from there, but it's almost like we are so many passion projects that are loosely interlinking. What does that circle structure look like, if that makes sense?
Yeah, well, for me, ideally, it would look exactly the same. It's a circle structure. And you do, in a sense, what I would call it's a circle structure of semi-autonomous organizations. Each might have its own mission circle or top circle. So you've got your farm operation, which is different than your housing operation, which is different than your training center operation. So they all might have their own agreements within them, but how you hold them all together in one eco-village, you're gonna want to have really clear agreements, or you're gonna get burned. Sooner or later, something's going to happen, and there's going to be lack of clarity, or someone who wants to have more authority than other people want them to have. And so I would just really strongly encourage that the two things, right? I started off with, I don't know if you were here at the very beginning, what's the aim or aims of the organization? How and who are going to make the decisions? Don't wait to figure out how and who and how the decisions are going to get made, because you're setting up your culture by making that decision. And if you wait on that, there's just danger. It might all work out because everybody's so enthusiastic and positive, but it may not work out. So the sooner you get that done, and you can do it on a milder level, like a network-based level, where you have delegates from the different entities coming in and having dialogue. So you're not quite ready to have a full sociocratic organization, but when it's time to, and okay, you don't want to have businesses starting without unclear agreements. You don't want to have a farm. You don't want to have people starting to farm without clarity of like, well, what happens if we decide that piece of land would be better to have houses on it instead of, cabbages? Well, now you have a fight on your hands because I already put a year's worth of time putting cabbages in there. Well, who gave you that authority? Well, nobody. There was nobody doing it. There was this piece of, like, there you go. Like, so.
Thank
Right.
you.
I think that is our time. I'm glad that we got something from everybody. I would just welcome a fairly brief closing round. How was this useful to you? What do you want to say about how this was for you? And as we say goodbye to each other here, and I'll start again from what I see here. So, Helen and company, to Jess, to Irena. And yes, getting that unmute thing happening, right?
Okay. So maybe we can quickly say 3 words, if that's all right.
I found it very comprehensive, rich, and I like your daring clarity.
Lots of great ideas that we have to take back to the rest of the community.
Yes, very rich and lots for us to process and do things with.
I love your concrete examples.
Very helpful, and yeah, lots of more work for us to do.
That's it.
Right. Jess and Irena.
Inspired by the statement when you address CJ's question about the fact that sociocracy success comes from the fact that there's longevity and that people keep showing up together, and that for me was really inspiring to see it from that perspective.
Irena and Timo.
Thank you. That was most useful, informative, and clear. And in a way, although it's just a document, very, very practical. And I will definitely find lots of ways to use this soon, hopefully. Thank you.
Timo and then CJ.
Yeah, thanks a lot to you, Jerry, and to everyone else for being here and sharing. So I enjoyed the event itself, and I took a few valuable insights that will help me advance. So I'm very grateful for that. Thank you.
And I should say for anybody that, we have training programs, so do go to our website to follow up on training programs if you want to learn more. Lots of different elements, from organizational structure to facilitation to real life practice of being in a sociocratic organization. CJ, then Ann.
Yeah. Oh, feel excited about all these bits, appreciative for all the templates and thinking that went into it, and for your awesome answers to my questions. Thanks.
Ann and then Balette.
Yeah, I feel really inspired to kind of start up with serious stuff now, because everything is going along so well when you're 10 people having the same thoughts, and we have tended to kind of just put it up in the future, and it's boring, with a lot of text and rules and regulations, but today it wasn't boring at all, so I feel really inspired. Thank you.
Good. Balette and then Ruth.
Thanks. I'm inspired by how the wise rules, or the bones of sociocracy, can create the culture of sociocracy.
Well said. Ruth and then Roberto. No, you're still muted, Ruth.
So sorry. I'm appreciative of the practicality of this document guide, and think in retrospect, putting something like this in place before our year of trying sociocracy might have helped guide the community in many ways. So thank you for this.
Roberto and then Audrey.
All very useful, very practical, a real help to go forward. So I want to second Audrey in thanking you guys so much for everything you share about sociocracy for everybody around. Thank you.
Audrey and then Linda.
Yeah, thanks again. And I really appreciated the firmness of like, you can be in the circle, you cannot be in the circle. Like, we want it to be efficient. I like that.
And I can attest that the trainings are really wonderful and they were super beneficial for our organization. So thank you for that. That was like the multi-week training program. And I really appreciated the insight you shared about the balance of trust and governance, and how with more trust you can have like leaner governance. And that to me is a lot of food for thought around what to prioritize in team building. So thank you.
And was Ariana your friend in Findhorn, or?
Jake. He's
Jake? Okay, it's somebody whose name I don't know. I'm glad to hear there's another sociocratic nerd in Findhorn.
Yes, they abound.
Great. We're looking forward to lots more work with Jen all over the world. Linda and then Terry.
Yeah, it's great to see that some of the building blocks are happening for sociocracy that enables people to use it and adopt it. And would be interesting to sort of be kept up to date with any legal developments that occur, if you could do that, because that would be really interesting and groundbreaking for the work I do. But thanks so far, it's been really helpful. Thank you.
And Mark, you know that there's an effort with Mark Simmons that's working with the co-op circle of SOFA, as well as I think he's going to be bringing some things to, I can't remember the name of the organization or the perspectives about creating materials for the co-op cooperative UK context.
Yeah, our governance panel. So yeah, so I'll be working with Mark. So I'll use him as a channel through. Great.
And Terry.
Well, I can just ditto what Ruth said, and actually, echo what many people have already said in terms of the usefulness of today and the benefit to our next proposal draft. And would love to hear more in the future, especially as we are diving into our legal documents, kind of what you learned from your work group. Thank you.
Great. Well, I can't really begin to tell you how much work went into trying to create, ultimately this document, because it went from, this document originally starts, with some ideas from what was written before, but it starts, the original document of this was working for our governance agreement in my co-housing community. And it's taken a lot to try to clean it up and make it more useful for others. And I'm hoping, that the next wave will be the legal aspects, as we keep looking for ease and replicability of sociocracy in the world. So with that, merry meet, merry part, merry meet again. See you in some other session or some other gathering sometime. Be well.
Bye, Jerry. Thank you.
You're welcome, Jess. See you soon.
See you soon.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Goodbye and thanks.
Bye-bye.